where do you draw the line between adding the what if scenarios on top of each other versus bringing it back down to our base level of just we got to get back to the basics and strengthen the foundation versus continually adding on new moves and new processes and different techniques
Mm.
to really build a player up?
Um, there's two ways you can go with accumulating knowledge in any combat sport. You can go with breadth of knowledge, where you try to learn a little bit about a lot. And you can go with depth of knowledge, where you try to learn a lot about a few things. The general pattern in combat sports is this. In order to defend yourself from the huge number of possible attacks that your opponent can bring upon you, it's important that you have breadth of knowledge. You have to know a little bit about a lot. Because if I know even a little bit, I can anticipate an attack coming. And anticipation is always the first line of defense. If I can see what the beginnings of an armbar looks like, even if I have a lousy armbar, I can see the setup, I can avoid it. So as far as defense goes, knowing a little bit about a lot is a huge benefit. But when it comes to offense, the exact opposite is true. Then you've got to select a small number of moves and have a huge amount of knowledge about those small number of moves. That's why my coaching style is always built around offensive systems. Essentially, I really teach 6 different submission holds, and I build extravagant systems around those 6. When one of my students gets into a battle over one of those submission holds, whether it be Kimura, a heel hook, or what have you, they know so much more in that isolated domain than their opponents that even when they've only been training 4 or 5 years and their opponent has 20 years, the amount of knowledge they've accrued and the amount of experience they've accrued in that one specific position is vastly greater than that 20-year veteran has. And so what we do is we create these knowledge wars in isolated areas where we have vastly more knowledge and skill in those isolated areas, even if we're less skilled overall than the opponent.
Yeah, we do the same thing in judo where our gripping system tends to bring people into a world that they don't understand the fight that they're in, and they don't know where to fight, where to defend, where to be offensive, when to attack, and it tends to break down our opponents when we're doing judo.
Excellent.
So how do you have your players bring people into that world?
You've got to have a set of basic entries from any given position. Now, the good news is if you operate with a sense of direction, it's pretty easy under most circumstances to pull an opponent into a given realm. You'll recognize this, of course, from gripping. If you just want an overback grip, let's say your throw required an overback grip, it's not that difficult to engineer a gripping sequence which accesses your opponent's back. If I want to get into my opponent's legs, it's not that difficult for me to go through gripping sequences which give me inside position and elevation and I'm in my opponent's legs. If I want a front headlock, it's not a difficult thing for me to fake legs, bring the head down, snap downs, et cetera, and I've got a front headlock. That sense of direction, along with some fairly simple, easily learned techniques to get into the scenarios we favor, is not a difficult thing. And you see that obviously in judo with grip fighting too. For example, I think it's fair to say that it's a hell of a lot easier to teach someone grip fighting sequences in the standing position in judo than it is to teach throws.
Yes.
Someone who's an incompetent thrower can be a damn good gripper.
Correct.
And can make themselves a real menace in the standing position just on grips.
Yeah.
So too in jiu-jitsu down on the ground, someone who had a guard which in some ways might seem quite deficient can nonetheless be very, very good at engaging in grips and elevating an opponent and getting into their legs. So you create this bias where when my students go out and see an opponent in front of them, they're so programmed as to what they want to do to get into legs, kimura, front headlock, etc., that they can engage in a gripping scenario where most of the action is going to be taken in towards those 6 systems that we favor.
Now, what happens when one of your players needs to also play defense to the other person's realm, or series of attacks that may avoid the scenario you're trying to be in?
That's a great question. And that leads us on to our next video series.
Oh,
We're about to complete the Into the System series with the armbar. And after that, we're going to go into fundamentals. One thing I always say to my students is this. Which one of the systems which I teach as far as attacks goes you favor the most? I leave that up to the students. Some will like these, some will like this. That's individual preference. But one thing I'll never let you go with is the fundamentals. Okay, if you don't have strong escapes, if you don't have a guard that is difficult to pass, if you don't have strong guard passing skills and all the essential skills of the sport, I don't care how good you are at the systems, at some point, someone's going to find a way to resist them and your game's going to get shut down. He's going to take you into territory that now you're unfamiliar with and you're going to get beaten. I always put a very, very high priority, especially in the early years, on people having a strong sense of the fundamentals of the sport. Systems-based approach to jiu-jitsu is wonderful. I made it my life's work, but all of that is worthless without a strong underpinning in the essential skills of the sport. Things like guard retention, guard passing. It's difficult to even conceive of someone who would be successful in the sport who didn't have a strong guard retention, who didn't have an ability to get past their opponent's legs, or at least put so much pressure on their opponent with those movements that they had to react in some way which set up your offense back into the systems that I teach. So always there's this juxtaposition between the need for strong fundamentals across the board, which I won't let a student get by without, and then on the one hand, once they've mastered that, building on top of that with the idea of preference and choice, where they get a choice between offensive systems, of which I focus mostly on 6.